Good morning, accounting students. We're going to continue to work today looking at some adjusting entries. Again, a few of these adjusting entries you have already done. It is nothing new. And then we're going to take a look at the reversing entries. And we discussed last week the reason we have to do the reversing entries is because we are recording that we have accrued interest at the end of the fiscal period, even though we have not received payment of that at that time. All right, so when we left off, we actually started working through the first few adjusting entries, which you've already done before, but let's go ahead and review those. So it tells us that on December 31st, 2011, Kaifas Corporation has one note receivable outstanding. It's 120-day, 6% for $10,000. It was noted November 16th. We also have one note payable outstanding, a 90-day, 6%, $12,000 note dated December 1st. Now, just as a review, when we are trying to figure out interest receivable and interest income for December 31st, we are only taking a look at the amount of time that it's currently past. So let's take a look at the first one. It says journalize the adjusting entry for accrued interest income and accrued interest expense on December 31st. So we have two transactions here with just this first one, and it's related to our notes receivable and our accounts receivable. So let's start with the interest income. It says we have one note receivable outstanding, 120-day, 6%, $10,000. Note date November 16th. It is now December 31st. So how many days have passed between November 16th and December 31st? 45 days have passed. So we have to do the math that we've been doing for several chapters on how to figure out our interest. So we're going to take 10,000 times 6% times 45 divided by 360. So this will give us our first adjusting entry, in which our interest receivable will be $75 and our interest income then is $75. Please go ahead and pause the video and record this transaction. All right, now we are still on number one. We need to journalize the adjusting entry for our accrued interest expense. That is related to the notes payable. Again, we have done this transaction before. So again, our notes payable is a 90-day, 6%, $12,000, and it is dated December 1st. It is now December 31st. How many days have passed? We have 31 days. So again, you have to take 12,000 times 6% times 31 divided by 360. When you do that, that is going to be $60. So interest expense and then our interest payable. Please go ahead and pause the video to record this transaction. All right. Now we're going to journalize closing entries. You have done closing entries before. Okay, this again is nothing new. So we are only going to do the closing entry for interest income and interest expense. We are still working with our general journal, page 14. And so, let me find. All right. Now what we need to figure out and take a look at is this. Up above, you will see we have an unadjusted trial balance. The interest income was $3,090. You had an adjusting entry for interest income of $75. So in order to figure out the new balance, you have to take that $3,090 plus the $75 to figure out the closing entry. Now, remember when we want to do our closing entry, this is our temporary accounts. Therefore, we want the accounts to be 0. Now, if it's interest income and the normal balance is a credit, what do we need to do to close it? We have to debit it. Now I want you to think back to our closing entries, SEID, and you need to think through what we close the interest income into. Hopefully you've said we close it into income summary. So let's take a look at what this transaction is going to look like. You're going to label closing entries just like you do for your adjusting entries. Please go ahead and do so. Once that is completed, you're then going to record interest income as a debit because we need it to become 0, and we're going to debit it for $3,165, which is $3,090 plus 75, gets us the $3,165. And so we're going to debit interest income, we're going to credit income summary. Please pause the video while you record this in your workbook. Okay. Now we're still on number 2 on page 656 because we need to now journalize the interest expense closing entry. Okay, so doing the same thing that we did before. Interest expense balance tells us at the top of the page that it was $1,315. We had an interest expense of $60, an adjusting entry. Therefore, our new balance is $1,375. Again, I want you to consider interest expense as a normal balance of a debit. We need it to equal 0. So what are we going to do? We are going to credit it. If we're going to credit interest expense, what are we going to debit? Hopefully you said income summary. All right, please go ahead, pause, so that you can record this entry. All right, now at this point, transactions number 1 and 2 on page 656, this has been a review. There's nothing new so far. Now we are getting to our reversing entries. All right, these as well are recorded in a general journal. So number 3, it says Journalize January 1st, 2012, reversing entries for accrued interest income and accrued interest expense on page 15 of a general journal. All right, so basically what you need to do is you're going to take a look going back up to your adjusting entries. We're not going to look at closing entries, we're looking at the adjusting entry, and what we are reversing is the adjusting entry. So you will notice we have interest receivable, $75, and interest income, $75. It is now January 1st. We need to reverse that entry. If we don't, what happens is when we record later that we've received payment of this interest income, it's going to look like we've received more than what we have. And again, I will lay that out for you again when I am back in class. But basically what you need to know for the reversing entry, it is literally the reverse of what you did on the adjusting entry. So if you would take a look, December 31st, we have for adjusting entry, we had interest receivable 75, interest income 75. We are now reversing that. Interest income will now be debited, interest receivable will be credited. And again, I will show that for you again on a T account when I return. Number 3 says we also need to do the same thing for our accrued interest expense. So again, same thing as above, you're just going to reverse the entry. Please go ahead and pause and record this in your journal. All right, we are now ready to move on to number 4. You need to turn in your workbook to page 116. It says now journalize the payment of cash for the maturity value of the note payable. Okay. Again, this is not a new transaction. We did this transaction in chapter 14, and we did this transaction again in chapter 16. So again, the same transaction keeps coming back. So now we just need to journalize the payment of cash for the maturity value of the note payable on March 1st, 2012. Now again, our note payable information is up in the top. We had one note payable, outstanding 90 days, 6%, $12,000 note. All right. So notes payable means that we need to pay, so it's going to be in our cash payment journal. Okay, also, if it is a notes payable, then the account notes payable is being impacted. If we are paying interest, interest expense is also being impacted, and then cash is being impacted. Now we know the notes payable amount is $12,000. All right? So that we can easily record. Interest expense we need to figure out. Now we need to figure out the full interest expense amount. Again, we've done this before. $12,000 times 6% times 90 divided by 360 gives us our interest amount. So therefore, our interest expense is $180, with cash being credited for $12,180. Please pause the video and record this in your workbook. All right, let's take a look at number 5. It says journalize the receipt of cash for the maturity value of the note receivable on March 16th, 2012. Again, take a look at back up the top. Our note receivable, 120-day, 6%, $10,000 note. Okay. If it is a note receivable, we know that our normal balance is a debit. We are receiving it, therefore the notes receivable is going to be credited. That's going to be impacted, and we know the amount is going to be $12,000. We also know that we have an interest expense. Interest expense, normal balance is a debit. We need to figure out what the interest amount is. So, $12,000. Oh, excuse me, this is going to be interest income. I said that backwards today. Interest income, because we're receiving the interest, so it is not an expense. Again, that will also be credited. And when we do the math, 10,000 times 6% times 120 divided by 360, our interest amount is $200. Therefore, we have received cash of $10,200. Okay. All right, this is where we're going to pause on 21.1. When I return, we're going to talk through 6 and 7 together, because then I'm going to be able to show you through a T account how the interest works and what that looks like as you are posting. Now, your next step is you need to complete the on your own 21.1, numbers 1 through 5. please complete those. I will be taking a look at those when I return, and then we will finish talking through the rest.